everyone remembers Star Wars and Star Trek. But see, there's other sci-fi voices of shows and people that we might forget. So if you hadn't thought of Dollhouse, Classic Battlestar, or Babylon 5 in a while, you gotta listen in. It's a Sci-Fi Diner classic, voices from a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. It's a Sci-Fi Diner classic, bringing you voices from the past. No, we ain't here a thing. It's a Sci-Fi Diner classic. Don't give me no news, just give me interviews and nothing else. No, nothing else. Hey, welcome to the Sci-Fi Diner Classic, and with me is Miles McLaughlin. How you doing, Miles?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
And my name's Scott Herzog. We're the hosts of the Sci-Fi Diner Podcast, have been for quite some time. Mm-hmm. We're old farts, I guess, in this industry. I'm not sure. And I guess it makes sense that we're talking about the good old days of the Sci-Fi Diner, right?
I guess if you hit 100 episodes, we're getting a little old.
Yeah, and you know, again, if you're new to the Classic, we've only done, 2, 3 of these maybe? And this will be our third or fourth one. And what we're doing is we're going back to some of our old episodes, that, the interviews are still dynamite in them. But, the news is old. The news is 2 years old. And who wants to listen to 2-year-old news to get to an interview? Mm-hmm. So we're just going to bring out the interview. And tonight, we're interviewing someone that's still relevant. Michael Strutt from NeoFX.
Right. He has lent his talents to first to folks at Starship Farragut, and also to our friends Browncoats Redemption, and he also lent some of his talents to the makers of the movie Yesterday Was a Lie.
Oh yeah, and then Phase 2. Does he do anything with Phase 2?
No, well, at least the last time we talked to him, he was not. They had their own people doing CGI for them, But yeah, right. So him and his team are a fantastic group of CGI artists, and that's what some of the things you could see. There's on their website is a little flash movie about some of the work they've done in the past. Yeah,
it's pretty incredible, mm-hmm. And we just had a really good interview. And originally, when we aired this interview came out, I think episode 27 or 28, something like that. And we'd split it into 2 parts because it was a pretty long interview, but we're combining it into one whole part. You've got the complete interview here for free, no charge.
Right.
And, but just, they'll hear a little bit of it. He'll hint at the fact that he's doing something in the future with the Browncoats Redemption. He may not call it by that name. We, of course, know that in the past 2 years, Browncoats Redemption came out. And, in fact, we're going to be talking with Mike in a few weeks here.
Very cool.
Yeah. So anyways, anything else you want to say?
Another thing... there was another thing he lent his talents for was a project to bring Star Trek back, the animated Star Trek back, but he did it with the crew of Farragut, and so
right.
Those 2 episodes of the animated Starship Farragut episodes, he talks in detail about, which was very interesting.
Yep, so it was phenomenal. So we hope that you enjoy this interview that we have from Michael Strutt from NeoFX. See you later.
You know Captain Carter and the crew of the USS Farragut. But you have never seen them like this. After 35 years, animated Star Trek is back. NeoFX and Farragut Films present Starship Farragut, the animated episodes. Damn the torpedoes. Warp speed ahead.
This is Michael.
Hey, Michael, this is Scott.
Hey, Scott, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great. How are you this evening?
Oh, not too bad.
With me is Miles.
Hi, Mike. It's nice to meet you.
Hey, Miles.
Yeah.
Great to meet you too.
Yeah. Well, we actually found out about you. Well, we've watched the Starship Farragut productions for quite some time here. Miles has been a fan for a couple years now.
I actually met you probably back in 2006 at a Farpoint convention. I think it was when you guys were, getting started with your project.
Yep.
So that was cool.
Yeah, it was funny. John Broughton from Farragut was just at the Creation Convention in New Jersey, and he got an opportunity to sit down with Richard Arnold, who was Gene Roddenberry's assistant for so many years.
Oh, wow.
And he just asked him a couple questions, and the interview ended up lasting an hour long, and he's trying to make it only 4 minutes. So I know I know that he's going to have some trouble editing and everything. But it was some good information. He and I like talking a little bit about his blog. It's mycaptainslog.com or something like that. I get on.
Yeah.
But something that John just started recently. He's getting into the 21st century now with the Captain's blog. So it's pretty interesting. But I've met Richard Arnold in the past down in California, and he's a great guy. Always has a fantastic story about how things, on Star Trek ended up turning into reality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, great. Well, we want to get a little bit more information about your interest in Star Trek, your interest in sci-fi in just a little bit. Why don't we start off by talking a little bit about how did you get into animation? And tell us a little bit maybe in the process about how NeoFX kind of got formed.
Okay. Well, NeoFX has been around since 2003 as just an animation company that does a lot of things like simple things like logos, things that are kind of the bread and butter of an animator. A lot of people don't get to work on full-length movies and features and things like that, so you end up having to make your bread and butter from editing wedding videos and putting text on wedding videos, and then expanding to that to training videos and things like that. And we were always interested in doing not only visual effects for movies, but also for Star Trek in particular, just because we're huge fans. And, this is not like when you're going out and looking for a job where you start doing the job for free and then somebody goes and discovers you and then you get hired. Unfortunately, in the visual effects industry, that's kind of how you have to do it. You have to kind of prove your wares before you can actually do things that are a little bit higher caliber. So what we ended up doing is just as a proof of concept. This is about 2003 when, there was rumblings in Paramount about there being a remaster of the original Star Trek. So what we did is we took an episode, very similar to what a lot of people had done before us, and took an episode, this one happened to be Space Seed, and redid the visual effects on them, cut out everything that had to do with 1960s special effects, and put in new CGI. And then also in the interim, since editing and storytelling has changed in the last few years, we ended up re-editing the whole episode, adding a few extra parts that went along with the Wrath of Khan, and then just start sending that out to everybody. It was a labor of love type project. And we ended up sending it, ironically, to the people who were doing the visual effects for Enterprise at that time. That's Eden. That would be Eden FX down in California.
Okay.
But they had already heard the rumblings that the Star Trek wasn't going to be on TV forever. So, but we kept doing it. We kept refining our product, and then we started seeing things on the internet start popping up, like Star Trek New Voyages. And I actually sent an email to the director at the time, Jack Marshall, and he invited me out to see what they were doing out there in Ticonderoga, New York. And I went out there and I was blown away by standing on the bridge of the Enterprise, and I came to find out that their special effects artist was this pseudonym of Max Rim, who ended up being Doug Drexler. And he was one of the visual effects artists that had worked on some of the previous episodes of Star Trek, in Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, things like that. And they were pretty impressed with my work. Unfortunately, with already having a visual effects artist, they had no need for any other additional help, at least at that time. But at that exact same time, there was a person named Paul Sieber who was working with New Voyages, and he had had an inkling of starting a new ship very similar to the Enterprise, and they were going to call it the Farragut. So Jack Marshall shared our quote-unquote demo reel, which has just ended up being Space Seed with new special effects. And Paul immediately gave us a call, and then that's how basically Starship Farragut started, was with us providing the visual effects for it, and then we got more into helping them edit it, flesh out stories a little bit more, and they in turn helped us with developing what they wanted their look of their 23rd century to look like.
Now their 23rd century obviously models pretty closely, or aligns pretty closely to the original Trek. Is that correct?
For the most part, what we like to consider it is if Star Trek had been done today, not to bring in J.J. Abrams' Trek or anything, but if the blueprint was already there, how would it look today if they use conventional special effects? And what it ends up looking like is a lot like what Next Generation, Voyager, and Enterprise end up looking like. And as chance would have it, we actually use the same software that the companies that did the special effects for those television programs used. So we're using the exact same thing. So we were able to get a very similar look at it with a primary light, in space somewhere with star fields, and kind of the more of the shadowing as opposed to the 1960s thing where everything was kind of brightly lit and oversaturated. I take it more like what the Star Trek The Motion Picture looked like, in that they went for almost hyper-realism in some of their lighting shots to where it was almost too dark. We kind of mirror that with it being space and it's dark, but we've gotten to balance that with some of the fundamentals from TOS, which are kind of, you get to see some of the detail of the ship.
Yeah.
Well, so I guess it'd be safe to say you would definitely describe yourself as a sci-fi fan.
Right. And, nobody gets into special effects, at least doing special effects for things like Star Trek, or without, referencing back to when they were a kid and seeing this stuff on television and just wishing they could be a part of it. And in some small way, we were, because we ended up, catching the eye of some of the producers of things that end up being more like real Trek, like Star Trek of Gods and Men, right, which had some of the original Trek actors. And there was a surreal moment when I first got the assignment. I was working on a phaser shot, and sitting there, in front of me on my computer screen was Walter Koenig. And I thought to myself for just a moment, it's like, I'll be damned, I'm working on real Star Trek. Finally.
I'll bet. Oh, wow. I'll bet. Now, for Of Gods and Men, did you do most of the effects? Did NeoFX do all the effects of Gods and Men, or just some of them?
No, we actually came in late in the game. We had been given a preliminary script long before the project ever started. And it's not so much that we passed on it, but it was just something that seemed like it was more of a pie in the sky. There were a lot of changes from the initial script to where they ended up shooting. They went through a lot of writers and producers. We came in at about Act 2. So everything beyond Act 2 that has to do with phaser fire, the morphing effect by by one of their characters, and the bright eyes of Gary Mitchell were all done by us.
Okay.
The CGI for the ships and everything else was already established, and while we could have done that, the cardinal rule of a movie is consistency. So they wanted consistency throughout the entire episode, and up until Act 2, they had not had any phaser effects, bright eyes, or any morphing effects. So that all happened in Act 2. So they were confident that bringing somebody else new in wouldn't mess with their production pipeline.
Yeah, and to keep a continuation as far as the style of effects and everything, it kind of allowed that to happen. So
yeah, there have been people who say that they love the visual effects. There's some people who did not like, especially the Starship models. And as being a CGI guy, I could notice right off the bat that there were a lot of different people working on this, because the style did intermittently change. However, there is a certain consistency that goes out throughout the whole film, and whether you agree with it or not, at least they kept their cardinal rule of keeping things relatively consistent.
Now, when you work on a project like Star Trek of Gods and Men, is it just you? Do you have a team of people helping you? I mean, how big of a group is NeoFX?
Well, it's kind of interesting. You'll ask, a lot of times you'll ask how many people are at ILM, or how many people are at Eden FX, and there's always a core set of people that are there: the management, the people that run the show, behind the scenes, the sales folks. But then the animators, they can grow and shrink based on how many projects they have in their pipeline. And if you take that model and you shrink it down to, some people who do what we do, we have the exact same thing. It's not that we have a constant staff of animators, but we have a pool of animators that we can draw from depending on the size of the project. And everybody works freelance in the visual effects industry pretty much without exception.
So you are technically the only employee of NeoFX?
Technically, yes.
Technically, yes. With a bunch of other people helping you out. So
absolutely, and then nobody works for free. So it's up to me basically to bring in the work and then pool it out as I see fit, or as necessity dictates on just how much we have to do.
Has doing Starship Farragut helped you get some other jobs? Now that people take notice of Starship Farragut, has that maybe given you some business?
It has, and it's kind of it's almost like what Leonard Nimoy will tell a story about. Is he'll talk about how he ended up being typecast as Spock for a long time, and he actually wrote a few books that actually dealt with him not being Spock, and then him coming to a final realization that at the end of the day, he developed that character. Spock is him, and he is Spock. And in the same way, we've come through that same progression with NeoFX, is that while we don't want to be known as the guys who will do, just Starship Farragut, Starship this, Fair Exeter, Gods of Men, what it comes down to is that we're really good at that. And that has allowed us to do other things that have built upon it. For example, talking about a progression of events, one thing leading to another. So I worked on Gods of Men with Jack Trevino. This is almost like the Oracle of Bacon. Everybody's related to Kevin Bacon in some ways.
Right.
So I worked on Gods of Men with Jack Trevino, who was a writer on Deep Space Nine, which starred Chase Masterson, who was also in of Gods and Men, who now is part of our animated episodes, but she also produced a movie called Yesterday Was a Lie, which we also worked on.
Right, I saw that on your site. Now, is that movie out yet?
What happened is that's almost like a I don't know. The director will probably shoot me for saying this, but that's kind of almost like a fan film as it is. But it had potential to be something else. It wasn't something that had a subject matter that was licensed and copyrighted by Paramount or anything. It was an original idea. But again, going back to the whole concept of you have to do things for free first and then get noticed in this industry, as opposed to, somebody taking a chance on you. What happened is that this director, producer, wrote this movie, and he ended up, funding it himself and bringing in a couple investors, with the hopes that it would be picked up by a distributor. And I don't think he actually released some information saying that he finally got a distributor. So everybody who worked on it, as a favor, as it were, or a volunteer, we all signed contracts on where we can get paid now because he has a distributor and has the money to recoup his costs.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's
a very,
cool.
Very interesting movie. Yeah, it is. It's a very interesting movie, and you'd be surprised on who's in that. I mean, I was watching some of the footage of it, and I noticed this guy that looked vaguely familiar to me, and I looked through the credits, and lo and behold, it's the guy who played Chewbacca on Star Wars.
Oh,
Peter Matthews.
Peter Mayhew.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's
so. And again, it's a small world type thing, but it's kind of neat to be able to look back and say, hey, I worked with the guy who played Chewbacca on Star Wars, even though I've never met the guy or anything, but. Who would have thought, 4 or 5 years ago that I would have, like Tim Russ and Chase Masterson's phone numbers in my phone to give them a call if I wanted to.
Right. Well, that's kind of cool. That's exciting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exciting. Now, we kind of touched on this briefly and then kind of moved on from it, but I want to delve into this a little bit more. You said that you obviously were influenced by sci-fi as a young kid. What was the sci-fi that kind of gripped you, that kind of drew you into the world of science fiction? What were some of the shows that kind of did that for you?
Well, basically anything that had to do with science fiction. Obviously, Star Trek is right there on top of things. I was born in the '60s, so there were a few things to go off of. The things that I do remember, and then you get into the Space 1999, the original Battlestar Galactica, and then you get into the time frame of Star Wars, and all kinds of good things. I think Star Trek, as much as it cliche as it sounds, it was really my biggest motivation to do things. I mean, I don't know of any kid at that time that didn't enjoy science fiction, that didn't go and dress himself up like Spock or the captain or something like that, and pretend that they had a bridge or something in their basement.
And so, do I dare ask what character you dressed up as?
Oh, I'm tall, thin, and have dark hair, so I'll let you make the guess.
Oh man,
I couldn't possibly imagine.
Man, I'm struggling here. I am. I'm really. You're making me work.
But you probably ran the science station or something, maybe.
Yeah. I don't know. But
I didn't get overly into it to where I was. I had my dad build me some wood props, if that means anything. I didn't build a science station or anything else like that, but I do recall. Unfortunately, there's no pictures of it. My mother putting some kind of eye makeup on me so that I'd have the pointed eyebrows and things. But like I said, that's not the cover of my Facebook page, so that's good.
No, and thankfully, there's no evidence of that. So
exactly,
except for this show. So
no. Yeah, and you have a huge listenership, right?
Right. So everyone will know.
But you are. I mean, if I heard correctly, you're going to be putting on some makeup again. Is it true you'll be playing a character of Thalen for Starship Farragut for their next live action episode?
Yeah, that's a kind of a nasty rumor. Did John tell you that?
We'll never tell.
So the fourth type of communication method outside of the internet is tell John, right?
Right, exactly. Oh, we love John dearly, but
yeah, that's an interesting concept. That goes back to the whole animated episodes that we're doing that are based off of Filmation. Ironically, Thalen was just a one-use character, which was kind of strange for Filmation just in itself, because Filmation was all about recycling. Even before the Earth turned green and everything, they were all about reusing things over and over and over and over again. But it was ironic that Thalen was only used once, and I don't know why it is, but I kind of felt that character needed a little bit more of a background. And when I was going to do the animated episodes, I had that character in mind. Very similar to that red character, Eric's, that was on the bridge of the Enterprise. They never did explain, number one, where Chekhov was, but they never also explained what the background of this character was. He was just there one day. And so I thought that would be kind of interesting, since Farragut didn't have any sort of aliens on their bridge, and that's for obviously practical reasons, just because it costs money to purchase makeup and apply it and everything else. So, but I thought that Thalen would be an interesting character, and that would work well with Star Trek canon, which seems to be the big thing that fans really want to, for anything to adhere to, is the canon. Phase 2 ended up killing Chekhov in one of their episodes, and they got nothing but grief for it, even though the story was relatively decent. So fans love canon. So there's nothing in canon that forbids Thalen to be in there. And I think with J.J. Abrams' movie out, I think that's the big important thing, is not so much following canon as making sure that canon doesn't deny what you're putting on the screen. Mm-hmm. So in that same way, Thalen is a character that is on the Farragut. Why? Well, we don't really go into it, but what it comes down to is that when he was shown in the original animated episodes, he was in an alternate timeline, because Kirk and Spock had messed up the timeline, and there was an alternate reality. created. So when they fixed the reality, Phelan's gone. Well, the theory would have it that Phelan had to have existed somewhere, and a certain set of events put him on the Enterprise. Well, with the original timeline fixed, probably some of that stuff still happened in the alternate timeline, or in the original timeline, but Phelan didn't get to go there. Why not put him on the Farragut?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So we ended up, brainstorming a little bit about it. Got the buy-in from the Farragut folks. And then it came time to figure out who would voice that character. And this is before we cast anybody. But I knew that character had to be on the bridge of the Farragut. So I started looking, and I looked back at the original. It was voiced by James Doohan, who ended up doing practically all the voices that were not the main characters on the original animated episode. And I thought to myself, well, it's a shame that James Doohan isn't around. And then it kind of just dawned on me. It's like, why don't I talk to his son, find out what he's doing these days? Got in touch with him, and he agreed. He does a dead-on impression of his dad doing an impression of Scotty, if that means anything. But he also does a pretty mean Phelan too, and I don't mean violent, but I mean a very dead-on impersonation of what his dad did for that character. So we developed that, and he did a fantastic job, I have to say, on doing what his dad did. But then we started talking about, in the Farragut, about doing it for a live action type thing and what that would take. So, being in the quote unquote entertainment industry now, I actually know a few makeup artists. So I had just as almost as a lark, had a set of antenna and a wig made up. And then it started going on and on and on about, well, let's see if Chris would be willing to do a live action version. And he lives on the West Coast, Farragut's on the East Coast, so he really wasn't really interested in doing a traveling thing like a lot of the Phase 2 folks were doing. And somebody suggested that I do it. And we've been tinkering with the idea, and I think that it might actually work. I'm by no means an actor.
Right.
But if you look at a lot of the fan stuff, a lot of these guys aren't actors, and they find their voice, and it is what it is. And maybe I can do it, maybe I can't. I don't know. You never know until you try. So right. I think we might actually give it a try and see what it's like. And if anything, I can take the original stuff out and put CGI in if it ends up looking terrible.
Right.
But you'll be bringing the first alien crew member on Farragut, so that's cool.
Correct. I mean, they always had Spock on the Enterprise, which is kind of with ears and eye makeup, and there's your alien. I think this one would be at least a little bit more interesting. Right. It wouldn't be the first time that an Andorian would have been on the bridge. As everyone knows, Exeter, another fan film, also has a character called Bafuzlak, who is on the bridge as a communications officer.
Right. I'm familiar with Exeter.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure it's going to be a great experience for you, and we look forward to seeing you in that role, and at least seeing you try that role. So it'll be interesting. And unfortunately, it's not the captain or first officer. So I would almost demand that I would be a supplementary character, that nothing be a story based on me. I wouldn't have, number one, the time to do it like that. But I don't. I'm a very humble person when it comes to my acting ability, because I know that I don't have any acting experience, so I'm not willing to put myself out there in that fashion. I know that I can do the visual effects in the background, and I really wouldn't want to distract from that. But it might be, like I said, fun as a lark to kind of do it. Oh, and you're a fan of you're a fan of the genre, so that plays into it. So,
and who would not, right. A fan of the genre would not want to be on an episode of Star Trek? I mean, that's every fanboy's dream.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, you get to live out your this whole fantasy that you have as kids, being on a Star Trek episode. Mm-hmm. So I mean, there's something to be said for that.
Right.
We've been talking a lot about the animation part of it. Now, the way we saw part 1 and part 2 just hit the internet. This past week? Is that correct?
Of the animated episode, yeah.
Yeah, and we have a part 3 that we're waiting for. Is that correct?
Correct, and part 3 should be out by the end of this month, being August.
Okay, well, this interview will probably air next week, so hopefully we'll be in anticipation of that. But let's. I want to talk a little bit about the style of animation and what you were looking back to and how closely you tried to replicate the original animated series of Star Trek. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Well, let's go back and talk a little bit about the original animated Star Trek, because I think that has a lot of parallels to what we did. As everyone knows, Star Trek was on TV from 1966 to 1969, 3 years. It developed quite a fan base. One of the big, let's call it complaints that people had about it is that there wasn't a lot of money. Network TV is never about doing it for the love of it. It's for selling commercials and, selling soap and body odor, deodorant or whatever. But they didn't have a lot of money at that time. And there was but it was good science fiction. There were a lot of people who wanted to see it continue. They brought it back as a Saturday morning cartoon. It ended up being developed by a company called Filmation in Southern California there. And Paramount obviously endorsed it. Gene Roddenberry was involved, but it was more of a Filmation venture. And one of the guys who started Filmation, Lou Scheimer, none of these guys were fans. So you'll notice that in some of the animation that they do, people's ranks change. Star Trek fans obviously notice these things. Ranks change, the color of their uniform change. Suddenly Spock has 6 fingers as opposed to 5. Little things like that. However, what they did do, and I think it's one of the bigger successes of the original animated episodes, were that they didn't scrimp on the stories. They brought back a lot of the same writers. D.C. Fontana ended up being a editor, I think, of the animated episodes, and she was really big. She wrote some of the more famous, original Star Trek episodes. So there were a lot of people who submitted stories, including Walter Koenig, who didn't get to appear on the animated episodes. So let's fast forward to Farragut and look at some of the parallels. Well, Farragut is a live-action fan project spearheaded by Farragut Films, John Broughton, and that gang. We've always been a Filmation kind of fan, but we've also felt that we would have the ability to do our own fan film if we wanted to. So it was kind of great that we ended up working with Farragut Films, because they gave us the opportunity to take that to the instead of the third dimension to the second dimension and make it basically a Filmation style cartoon. But since we were spearheading this as opposed to Farragut Films, all I would need from the Farragut crew is their voices. I don't need any sets. I don't need any costumes. I don't need any makeup. So let's, we were going to do this. So again, we developed what characters would be on there. We kept the majority of the main crew, the 4 big top people, Carter, Smithfield, Tackett, and Prescott. The communications officer is the person that you see in the very first episode of the captaincy, and the doctor and the chief engineer are played by the same people. Other than that, we had open characters for security, and then a helm and navigation person.
Okay.
So what we wanted to do is we wanted to take this to the next level. One of the big limitations of original Star Trek, as I mentioned, was the money situation. And in a fan film, that even becomes more, and excuse the pun, paramount, because fan films have no money to do some of the adventures that, some of these writers would want to do. Again, Thalen would be an expensive character to do as just a one-off, just because it takes a lot of time and makeup just to get the character looking right.
Right.
So in an animation format, you don't have those limitations. So what we did is we, developed who the crew would be, but then I wanted to take it kind of to the next level. Everybody's done a fan film, it seems. If you go on the internet and look up fan films, everybody's doing one from before, Kirk and Spock to all the way past, the next generation. So everybody seems to be doing a fan film, but I think one of the things that a lot of those fan films kind of miss is the opportunity to bring in real actors. Everybody wants to play the captain. Everybody wants to be on screen, even if they may not be suited for it. They may not be actors. They may not be physically the right shape to be what people would consider a captain or whatever. So we wanted to do something with a little bit more, I don't know, notoriety, and not just do it ourselves. Because in animation, you could do that. You could be every voice out there. As long as you're able to change it, you could do it. But we wanted to bring in some professional actors, and that's a whole nother story about how we had to join the Screen Actors Guild in order to do that, because you just can't give an actor a call on the phone and say, hey, you want to record this line for me? There's all kinds of formalities that you have to go through.
Right.
And I have to hand it to Chase Masterson, and just because I happen to know Jack Trevino from working on Of Gods and Men, he kind of introduced me to Chase, and she kind of really, I have to hand it to her, spearheaded helping us get into the Screen Actors Guild so that we could hire them to do these voices.
Oh, wow.
But then once you get into that kind of inner circle, or at least in my case, the boundaries of the inner circle, you end up, it kind of snowballs. So first we got Chris Doohan, he works at Kaiser Permanente down in California. He's not a professional actor by trade, but he's wanted to get into it just obviously because of his, his upbringing and seeing, one of his best friends is Danny Bonaducci. And I got a whole other story about that when we were in the recording studio, and Danny almost came in and, recorded a couple lines, but unfortunately he was out of town. But anyway, we had Chris Doohan almost from the beginning after we contacted them, and then Chase came on board. After Chase came on board, they were my two biggest advocates for bringing in other folks that could really take this project to the next level. So after that, we ended up being contacted, on a reference from Chase Masterson, getting in touch with Vic Manana. It's a strange spelling of his name, but he isn't really related in any way to Star Trek, as it were, but he's a big anime voiceover artist. And in this kind of industry, with animation, you really want dynamic folks who can do the voices.
Right.
It's one thing, and that's one of the kind of the criticisms of actually the original animated Star Trek episodes, is that everybody knows that Shatner is a quote unquote character. In real life, he's just a character. Unfortunately, some of that personality didn't come over as well when he was just reading his lines for Kirk. You couldn't see him, and obviously the animation was so primitive, as it were, at the time, that some of the nuances of Captain Kirk didn't come through with the animated character. And we're actually getting a little bit of that same grief with the original cast. They're not voiceover actors; they're not actors in the first place. But it felt right to have them in the same roles that they played as a live action character. But in order for some of the supplementary characters to really have some oomph, we needed to bring in somebody who had experience doing that. And actually, Chase had some voiceover experience, as had Vic, who had a lot of voiceover experience. As a matter of fact, he plays about 2 or 3 different characters in the episode, and he can't even tell. He's just that good. Wow. And then the final person that came in was kind of a lark as well. I've been emailing back and forth Jack and all this stuff, and I got an opportunity. I booked a recording studio down in L.A., and I was going down there, and this is at the same time that the Burbank Star Trek convention was going on. I can't remember if it's a creation or whatever, but needless to say, I thought, you know what, I'm going down there. Let me see if Tim Russ, who was the director of Gods and Men, would be available to do a line. The old adage of, you never know what people are going to say until you ask them, and the worst thing that they can say is no.
Right.
That is the worst thing. The worst thing is that they could say no, and you're no worse off than you had been. But the good thing is a lot of times these guys are willing to help out. And Tim Russ, I have to say, is probably one of the biggest Star Trek fans himself than any other actor I've ever met, because he loves doing this stuff. He loves producing. He loves directing, and he's a good actor too. So we had this Vulcan character, and it was going to be played by somebody else, probably Chase if we couldn't find anybody else, but it was just a Vulcan character. It didn't have to be male, didn't have to be female. I emailed Tim one day asking him about some visual effects on Of Gods and Men, and I mentioned our project. Lo and behold, he was getting into voiceover acting, and a lot of actors love voiceover work just because they don't have to get into makeup. they can sit down, do their lines, and then walk away with the check. So it was kind of a lark. He was going to be at the convention anyway. We arranged it, and he shows up, does his line, sit down, he gets his check, and he walks away. But it ended up being great. He's a kind of a one-take kind of guy. So we got into that. And then the big thing for me, obviously it's a big thing to be working with these actors. And I think this is another thing that a lot of the fan films kind of miss, is that they are playing in somebody else's sandbox, as it were. Star Trek is a licensed property.
Right.
And obviously none of these fan films can make any money. But it would be nice to at least get an endorsement. And I every day wish that Gene Roddenberry was around to be able to see what the thing that he created was doing, and just to get his opinion on what he thinks of it. He may hate it, but then again, he may love it. One of the big things that I got to do, being a Filmation fan, was I got to meet Lou Scheimer. And that's, again, one of those things where if you don't ask, then the answer is always going to be no. But if you ask, sometimes the answer is going to be yes.
My mother always said, "You have not because you ask not."
Exactly. So the story with that is almost surreal. We've gotten into the production of this thing. I was going down to L.A., and I thought to myself, I wonder if Lou Scheimer's around. Actually, it came more about along the lines of we were trying to track down the original music and sound effects from the animated episodes. We knew that Sam Horta, one of the big cartoon and sound guys back in the 60s and 70s, owned those original tapes. So I gave his daughter a call, and she said, well, I don't have those. You may want to call Lou Scheimer. So she gives me his home phone number, which is kind of rare. It's kind of rare in L.A. as it is. Now, Lou Scheimer is 80 years old. He probably doesn't get a lot of people sitting at his front door waiting for him to sign autographs, and he's very humble about his place in, animation history. But unfortunately, I don't think he fully appreciates it. You go and do a search for, people who really did groundbreaking work with getting animation being accepted as it is today, and you'll find three names: Hanna-Barbera, Walt Disney, and Lou Scheimer. Wow. I didn't, again, if you expect nothing, then anything that happens is going to be, fantastic. So I left him a message. What do you know? Half an hour later, I get a call, and he says, "This is Lou Scheimer calling." It's like, wow, really?
Wow.
Friendliest guy. It was like talking to my grandfather. We talked for practically an hour, and I said, "Hey, I'm going to be down in L.A. I don't want to impose or anything. You want to come over and see my house?" It's like, okay. Here's directions on how you get here, and he gives me all these directions to his house. And I the first thing everybody I think does is Google, an address to make sure that, number one, they can get there, and number two, what it looks like so that they can expect it. And it looked like it was just a regular neighborhood, and I think, okay, well, we'll do that. So I get in L.A., and I follow these directions, and I get to where his address is, and it's like an empty lot, or what it looked like an empty lot. And it's like, oh, man. Did I follow the wrong directions or something?
Right.
So I look at where the address is, and there's a gate there. So he did mention something about pressing a button on a gate, or making sure that he hears. So I press the button, and he says, "Yeah, this is Lou." It's like, "This is Michael. He invited me over. Can we?" "Oh yeah, come on up." He opens his gate, and I think, okay, it's just around the corner. So I start going up this driveway, and up, and up, and up, and I'll be damned if it wasn't just a giant house on top of a hill in a regular neighborhood in the middle of the Hollywood Valley.
Wow.
And I was just blown away, and I said, wow, cartoons pay really, really, really much.
Wow.
And I'd never met Lou Scheimer before in my life. I'd seen there's a little featurette at the end of the animated episode cartoons where they featured him, and it was about 4 or 5 years ago that they filmed this. And he comes popping out of his house, little 80-year-old man, not little, he's like 6'3", 6'4", but he comes popping out and greets me, and he takes me up to his office, and this office is like, if you're a collector of animated stuff, and Fat Albert, Jason of Star Command. There's a model of the original Jason of Star Command ship sitting there on his desk. all kinds of stuff that I think, a collector would probably just, fall over dead with the amount of stuff that's in there, just memorabilia. There was a robot that was on one of the episodes, of the live action episodes, that was sitting there in one of his guest rooms. It's like, wow.
Wow.
And then he says, "You want to go to lunch? I'm buying." It's like, okay, we'll go to lunch. So we sat at, California Pizza Kitchen in, Tarzana, California, for 2.5 hours talking about his history with animation. And the very last thing he said to me was, "This is a great project. You shouldn't be doing it for free, but, more power to you, and I completely endorse this thing. I'm glad that you guys are still looking at this stuff 35 years later and appreciating it." And it's like, wow, that's the biggest compliment that somebody in my position could have outside of Gene Roddenberry coming up from the grave and endorsing, Farragut.
Wow, absolutely. What an endorsement to get one of the original creators behind it.
That's
and you have to preface this though by him not giving me permission, because he even said, my endorsement doesn't mean jack just because, he doesn't own the property rights to it. Paramount does.
Right.
And,
right.
Lou has some very firm feelings towards big corporations that try to take, the ideas and stuff and kind of mass market them and kind of take the love out of them. But outside of that, he completely endorses the concept of what we're doing and fully, he even recorded some lines for our episodes that he's, one of them is the original character that he played back in the original episodes.
Oh, wow. So you actually have him in the animated series?
Yeah. One of the things that happened a lot during the Filmation days, it was literally brute force animation. They had a lot of people drawing all the time. And, deadlines were tight, very, very tight. Money was even tighter. And you'll notice on some of the animated episodes, even though they're not credited, you have what's his name? Who played the boss on Mary Tyler Moore? Ted Knight.
Yeah, Ted Knight.
Ted Knight played a few characters on there because and Lou has this fantastic story of when Filmation was just getting started. He and Ted Knight were friends, and he had Ted Knight come in and sit in an animator's chair because they had investors coming in, and they wanted to make it look like they had a lot of people there, and they didn't know a lot of animators or people, so they just set people that happened to know down and said, "Draw something, make it look like you're doing something."
Wow.
But Lou. And when times were tough and you couldn't get a voiceover artist or whatever, Lou would go and record his own. And there's an episode called Practical Joker where there's a Romulan on the screen, and that's Lou Scheimer. And he did it uncredited. But that same Romulan, not the same one, it doesn't have to be the same one, but he basically, we took that image and made it a character in one of our episodes. And Lou actually plays that character again, and it sounds just like him.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. That's awesome. Now, obviously, 35, 40 years ago, they're working with different ways of animating the characters. Now, obviously, stylistically, you kind of adhered to the original animated series, but how is it different trying to capture that with modern technology versus what they were doing 30 years ago?
It is kind of ironic that you'd ask that, because we have gotten a lot of flack lately. I'm not sure if it's just because we didn't, express how we were going to do this or what it would look like. Some people were actually pretty amazed that we went with the Filmation style of animation. And it seemed almost like a no-brainer to me. If you're going to do classic Trek and you're going to do a cartoon of classic Trek, it has to be Filmation. That's what everybody would expect. The same way that if we would have thrown original music on there as opposed to using, the original soundtrack, it wouldn't feel the same. So we wanted that same thing, even if it was over the top and redundant. This isn't meant to be any sort of new and revolutionary type of 3D cartoon or anything. It ends up being just a kind of a loving tribute to Filmation.
You're playing homage to, the original animation that was done 35 years ago with this.
Exactly. And like I said, the original Star Trek animated episodes were never, ever about, groundbreaking animation. They were about telling good stories in a short amount of time to an audience that loved Star Trek. And I think in that case, we're doing the exact same thing. We're telling some really good stories. Jack Trevino and I wrote one story, and then I have another writer who is the president of Magic Productions down in Las Vegas write the other one, and that's the current one that's out right now is Power Source.
So you have a second one in the works?
Yeah, there's a second one, and we can get into that after a little bit. But to get to your question about the animation style, what we did is we took it and break it down because outside of the music, outside of the very stiff characters, I think what people remember most is the kind of stylistic, stylistic style of Filmation animation. And when you go and look at that practically frame by frame, like I've been doing for the last 2 years, you find out that they did things to, again, save money. A lot of times with the lip syncing, they only synced every other frame. So in a 24 frame per second film, you only had to move the mouths 12 times during a frame instead of 24. I'm sorry, during a second. So those are some of the kind of the shortcuts that we tried to replicate. If you did a space shot, what you would do is you would have it move every frame, because in the original animation, what you would do is you'd simply pull it across the screen while the camera was running full screen or whatever. So the big thing that I think people do not know is how much work all of this is to create something that was created back in the 1970s. And we've kind of taken great strides to make it look like it was. Yeah, we've taken great strides to make it look like it came from the 70s. Not so much all the mistakes that they made. They were under a huge amount of deadlines and time constraints. We're not under that same thing, but we made it so we fixed some of the common editing problems that they had in the past and consistency problems. But really, the spirit of the whole thing is still there. So you'll have the people. Yeah, you'll have the people move in a very similar fashion. The whole, I think the one thing I always remembered from the show when I was a kid is just how they ran. It was such a stylistic where their elbows would raise and then they would come forward towards the camera. And it's amazing when you break that down to see how they actually did it, that you had animators who were redrawing each and every one of those frames. Now, we had the advantage of having two of the top animated fan sites out there, StarTrekAnimated.com, run by Cale Teskar, and he's actually one of our associate producers on this episode, and he's our main artist. He's dedicated practically the last 12 years of his life to figuring out exactly what I tried to figure out, which is how they did their characters, what kind of style did they use, how did the characters move, how did the cells interact with each other. Each animation cell is on a separate, layer on a light board, and you just simply take a picture of it, move the cell, put a new one on, take a picture, on and on and on. Now, obviously, we're doing that, on a computer, so it's a lot quicker in some respects. But a lot of that stuff has to be pre-drawn, and that's a lot of what Cale has done, is kind of capture the spirit of the characters, and then we send them off to other animators, very similar to what they did back in the 70s. There, you'd have a good artist who would capture the essence of the character, and then you'd have some of these other artists do the lip movements and the head turns and things like that. The other artist that we have helping us out is Kurt Danhauser, who runs danhausertrek.com. And he's actually gone and done a couple animated episodes himself using the original Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. And he took the route that we talked about earlier, where he did all the voices. Him and his wife and probably one other person did all the voices in there. And you can kind of tell, but he did a real good set of stories. Again, it had nothing to do with the animation. It had to do with the stories he was telling. So, it was the big thing was capturing the essence of the four main characters, Carter, Prescott, Smithfield, and RT, or Commander Tackett. And then getting other people to participate and do the things that we need, because Cale will be the first to admit that he's not a traditional artist. He can trace these characters or rotoscope them very, very well, and that's how you capture the essence of the characters, by taking real pictures of them and drawing outlines of them and kind of capturing what makes them unique. But then it takes a very traditional artist to do things like lip movements and head turns to make it look realistic, or at least realistic in the style of filmation.
Yeah. Well.
So to answer the last part of your question, though, it takes a lot of effort, and we've actually had a lot of people ask us, well, how did you do this? How did you do that? What it comes down to is we produced this cartoon very, very similar to how they produced it back in the 70s, not with a light board and animation cells, but by people taking traditional drawings in the computer, like in Photoshop. And if you know Photoshop, they can do layers. So you have an arm layer, you have a head layer, you have a mouth layer, you have an eye layer.
Sure.
We could have done this a lot simpler, but I think by using something like Flash or something like that. But not all the artists were versed in Flash, and to get that, I was familiar with compositing in Adobe After Effects, and then timeline editing in Adobe Photoshop, Premiere. So what we did is we bring in all of these characters and we animate them by hand in After Effects, which allows you to composite with layers, export that to a movie file just like you would have exported it to film, and then you edit it just like you'd edit any other program where you use a timeline editor, cut it here, do a transition here, things like that. But getting the strange analog style of doing things like there was always how would you say it? When the view screen, for example, focuses. You guys know what I'm talking about. You're on the view screen and you want to change view from view A to view D. Mm-hmm. And it kind of has that wavy effect. Does that make sense? Kind of a wavy effect as it goes from one to the other.
Okay.
What was happening is that to get the kind of effect that they would do, and this is one of the things I had to consult with Lou about, that when they would do these morphing or transition type things, it almost looked like there was something on the lens or something like that they were moving across there. And he said that they ended up when they were doing some of these practical shots, that they were actually putting Vaseline on the lens to get this kind of blur effect.
Okay.
And when he told me that, it came almost apparent to me on how I would do that in the animated format or in the digital format, where you mask off a section, you blur that section, you move that section across there, and I'll be damned if I didn't get the exact effect I was looking for just by understanding how the original effect was done.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it comes down to basically doing these things almost like a traditional cartoon back in the 70s, where you create each scene and then you edit it just like you would edit a normal film.
Well, a couple questions here, then we need to wrap up this interview. How many man-hours have gone into animating this 3-part Starship Farragut episode? Do you have any idea?
I do, and it's it's not really good. Somebody's asked me that whole thing themselves because they've actually wanted to do something similar, not that I wouldn't do it again. It's just that if I'd known from the beginning what I was in for, I might have not been so ambitious, but I'm glad I was, because the end result is something that I know that unless somebody has the love and the dedication, that they won't do themselves, so we'll have something unique that's out there. So the first episode is always going to take the longest because we started from ground zero with nothing but the original animated episode DVDs. Mm-hmm. And I'll be the first to admit that we, I won't say stole, but hijacked some of the backgrounds, reprovisioned them, recolored them so that there's a little bit of consistency, and then used them in our animated episodes. So we basically started off from scratch with nothing. So we first did the characters, developed the characters, got the stories written. So the first one always takes a long time. What I'm finding out, though, is even though it took about a year and a half to get from concept to what you're seeing this month, which is the release of Power Source, in just a week and a half, I was able to edit the first act and 2 pages of the next episode without any problem. So it becomes more of a snowball effect. As I get more of these assets, as more of the characters are developed, as more of the processes and techniques are developed, it's going to be quicker and quicker. Now, the obvious question that comes from that is, we have 2 that are in the pipeline. Is there going to be a third? If you would have asked me 6 months ago, I would be surprised if there was going to be 1.
Oh, okay.
But as I've come and, over this last week where I've, had this lull and, Power Swords is pretty much done. I'm just waiting for a few more frames to get done here and there. And it only took me a week and a half to put, the first act together. I think it's really practical to be able to do another episode. But again, we're not going to just settle for something. We want to kind of go a step above. If I'm going to do it, it's going to be with a professional writer. Hopefully somebody that has, Star Trek experience or something that, we can attach a name to. Obviously, that would get a little bit more press than just some guy off the street or a fan script. Mm-hmm. And then hopefully they know people who would want to participate in this. Somebody maybe from Star Trek, but, more professional voice actors and things like that. So if we do it, it's going to be a step above what we're doing now.
Absolutely. Now, where can fans who are listening to the show find the Farragut episodes, the animated series episodes?
Right. Well, so we have our own unique URL that is separate from the StarshipFarragut.com website. You can still find them at the main Farragut site, StarshipFarragut.com. But we've set up our own animated website at Farragut-animated.com. That's FARRAGUT-ANIMATED.com. Farragut-animated.com. And you'll find all the background on, some of the things that we talked about tonight, the episodes, some artwork that people have, that some of our artists have created. And you can even buy stuff. You can buy T-shirts or whatever. We are very careful not to cross the line on doing anything that violates Paramount's copyright. Right. Starship Farragut is a unique product of Farragut Films, even though it's in the Star Trek universe. So a picture of John Carter doesn't violate anything in Paramount's canon. So we're allowed to do that. Have people take a look at Farragut-animated.com, and if you're interested in neo-effects and any visual effects work outside of this animated stuff, our website is neo-fx.com, neo-fx.com.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for spending the last hour with us and chatting about your work in the Star Trek fan film base, which you obviously support, but also especially your work in the Farragut and the animated series that they're doing.
Great. Well, I appreciate the time. I know I can ramble on a lot about this stuff, but it's just because of the love of the product that we have for it, and it's been a great ride, and I hope it continues.
Oh, absolutely. Well, we hope it continues. We look forward to seeing more episodes. Go ahead, Miles.
I'm admirer of the episodes that Farragut's put out so far, so I'm continuing to look forward to whatever you guys continue to put out.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, not to mention they're just such great guys to work with, so...
Yeah, and that's one of the nice things about Farragut is that it's almost like a community of people who are all interested in the same things. It doesn't feel like a job. It doesn't feel like a business. It feels like just a bunch of fans that want to do stuff for the fans.
Absolutely. Well, thanks a lot, Mike. We appreciate you sitting down with us on the Sci-Fi Diner podcast and chatting about NeoFX and what you guys have been doing.